Hello and welcome to the Pre-Chiro podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Glass, and today we're making a professional chiropractic connection with Dr. Robert Affolter. Dr. Robert, can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about where you were at in life when you decided you wanted to become a chiropractor?
Oh, so I was a child. My father was a chiropractor. I'm second generation. So my father was in the Army and developed headaches. And the Army told him it was because of his eyes. He said, I left the Army with 6 pairs of glasses and I still had headaches. So when he got out of the Army, he went to Korea. And when he got out of the Army, my mother said, um, she'd been helped by a chiropractor for her headaches. Now, it was interesting. She'd fallen out of a swing as a child and not only got headaches, but she also became an epileptic. So she'd had some relief with her headaches from chiropractic. So they went to a chiropractor in Manhattan, Kansas. And this doctor was an upper cervical specialist. And when he adjusted them both, my mother stopped having epileptic seizures. And my mother died last October at the age of almost 89. And she never had another epileptic seizure after that chiropractic adjustment. So that doctor convinced my father to become a chiropractor. And because of my experience as a child, I decided to follow in his footsteps.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really a pretty early experience, but I've had a broad experience. My father also said that during his schooling at Palmer, one of his classmates had to go back and take all the prerequisites because he wanted to practice. I think it was in Canada. And the province where he wanted to go changed the prerequisites. And he'd almost finished his chiropractic schooling, had to drop out, go back and take the prerequisites again, and then re-enter chiropractic college. So I determined I didn't want to do that. So I figured chiropractic was never going to get worse than medicine. So I went to the University of Kansas and completed all the requirements for medical school. So, and then along the way, I've always been interested in business. And along the way, I found out about the MBA program, decided, well, I'll do that because no matter what, that's going to be helpful. And then during the MBA program, one of my professors said we should put our resumes in KU's resume book. So I did that. IBM wound up asking me to interview. I wound up working for IBM for 3 years. And my father died unexpectedly, and I shifted back to chiropractic. So that's kind of the long-winded way of how I got into chiropractic again.
So to be clear, did you do the MBA and work for IBM before you went to chiropractic school?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
And it's really that background has really affected how I look at life, because I knew nothing about computers at the time. And, so this was in 78. And I wasn't in a computer science program. I'd never seen a computer. This is back when we were punching cards and and it was really interesting. Anyway, so I wound up going to there was a 12. It was supposed to be about an 18-month training program, and I accelerated it and finished it in a year. But when I went to that first class, I was in with somebody who had been a computer science person, and I said, "So I don't understand, what does a computer do?" Well, that's how ignorant I was about computers. But I actually became a systems engineer for IBM and learned a programming language, which was assembler, which is the lowest level programming language. So it's the one step above the zeros and O's. You're trying to figure out, we're looking at machine code. And so it really gave me an idea about programming. And now what I'm teaching is the duality of chiropractic. Chiropractic was really built on this duality, that there's a spirit or soul, or what we call an innate intelligence, that's running our bodies. And the way I've changed or brought the things I've brought to our philosophy is, if we look at our brain as a biocomputer, the brain can actually work without the intelligence, just like a computer. We can't tell if I bring up Alexa on my, or Siri or whatever, and you're talking to something, it's really difficult to tell that you're not talking to a person, right? Because that programming's gotten so good. Well, if we look at the programming of the brain, there's a lot of that might be running without an intelligence actually making decisions. But if we can get the intelligence working and controlling things, then it's helpful. And I think a lot of the problems that we have in society is because we're not really using our intelligence. We're just letting things run. And when we let those programs run, that becomes our ego. And that's what we're fighting with each other about, is it's one person's ego against another, where we're not really backing out of that and taking control of our brains and thinking about things. So that's what I'm enjoying right now, is trying to teach people to back out, think about things, and then go forward. So I think it changes how we think about everything, not just chiropractic. I'm not hearing you.
I was going to ask you if you could apply what you were just describing to a high school, college student, or career changer who's just becoming exposed to chiropractic and starting to explore what chiropractic is, and is starting to wake up their thinking to, maybe I want to become a chiropractor one day. How would you orient them to maybe explore the profession? I know you've written some books. I'm just curious. What you just described right there is getting people to take a step back from the situation that they're in and maybe see beyond the horizon. Can you kind of just keep going with that, but just speaking specifically to people in this scenario that I'm describing?
Sure, I think it gets back to what makes the most sense to you. So and it gets back to physics. So in the courses I'm teaching right now, one of them is mental mastery. And I start with physics, and I say, okay, if we look at Newton's laws, we know Newton's laws aren't what really governs things when we get into Einstein and some, other things. But if we start with Newton's laws, there's a really fun one. The first thing is, if you look at Newton's laws of motion, the first one is the law of inertia. And inertia states that a body at rest remains at rest, or a body in motion remains in motion in a straight line, unless acted upon by an outside force. So we know that when we change brain states, the brain actually makes new neural connections. Where did the force come from? What caused that neuron to change? And if it's the environment, then we have no control. We have no free will. So in order to get free will, most of us are agreeing, I think, that there has to be a duality. And by duality, I mean there's this physical stuff that physicists are looking at, but there's also something else. So what you really have to look at is, if you go back to the beginning, the Big Bang, was there something that started the Big Bang? In chiropractic, in our traditional chiropractic philosophy, we call that universal intelligence. So the universal intelligence actually created the universe. Now, if you believe that things started with an intelligence, then you'd want to control things using the intelligence, right? I mean, that'd be what you'd want to go back to. If you don't believe there ever was an intelligence, if you think things are just the physicality, the physical stuff, then you believe in the beginning was just energy and matter. Well, how would you change things then? Well, you'd go back and change the chemistry. So if you follow this along, what I did, my contribution to this mental mastery was to say, okay, let's take physics now and apply that to biology. Let's apply that to evolution. Well, if you start with chemistry, and eventually chemicals come together and they form a cell, and the cells come together then and form an organism, and the organism eventually develops a brain, and the brain then eventually develops thoughts and becomes self-conscious, and that becomes you and me. We could have predicted all those things. It actually came to me when I was reading In Search of Schrodinger's Cat by John Gribben. And Gribben's a physicist, and he's trying to explain quantum mechanics. And he said, the question physicists have been ducking since the time of Newton is the universe determined? And by determined means we could exactly predict everything that would happen. And once we knew Newton's laws of motion, we said, okay, if we knew all of the laws, if we knew the exact position and velocity of every particle of matter in the universe, and all wise intelligence that knew all that could predict the future. Well, if we could predict the future, that means we could predict the anatomy of my brain, and I'd know what my thoughts were going to be. If we follow that, does that make sense? If we follow that line of reasoning, in other words, I'd have no free will. It's all based on what happened to me yesterday. And what we wind up with is this programmed brain that is actually being controlled by its environment. And that's why you see books that say there's no such thing as free will. So what I did is I turned around and said, well, wait a minute. If I can control my brain, and that's what mental mastery is about, I actually have people think about a thought. Doesn't matter what the thought is. I actually picked this up from Vernon Howard. And he said, think about, I think he used a yellow pear. I use a red ball. But it doesn't matter what the object is or that it's even an object. If you think about a thought and you just sit and close your eyes and try to concentrate on a thought, what most of us find is eventually our thoughts wander away. But we can catch it. Oh, I wandered away, and we can bring it back. Well, where did that force come from that caused the brain to change and bring it back to a thought? Well, if you believe that you are something other than your brain, then you're starting out where chiropractic starts out with a consciousness or intelligence. And we're saying the one that created the universe is a universal intelligence. And the one that controls and what we really are is a spiritual or soul or something that controls our brain. That's what's making the decisions. So if we start there, it changes everything. It changes how you look at life. It changes how you look at the body. And what we're trying to do is what chiropractic started out trying to do. I mean, all of us aren't in agreement with this, by the way. If somebody wants to go into chiropractic and have a very materialistic approach, there are those within our profession that agree with that, and you can find that here too. But I'm taking, I guess, what would now be a more extremist approach. I'm going back to what the basics were. And I started in 2004. I was teaching chiropractic philosophy online through ChiroCredit. And I stopped in October. I had him cancel the courses because I really thought they needed to be updated. But I was going back through the philosophy of our founder, D.D. Palmer, and how he was thinking about life. And if you really start what I just said with a soul or some intelligence that's forming our bodies, then what he was saying is, look, it looks like it uses our brain and nervous system as the primary means of controlling and coordinating our bodies and adapting us to our environment. And chiropractic is really about adaptation. How do we change? How do we adapt to our environment? And we use our brain and nervous system as the primary means of control. So how do we get out of control? Why do we get sick? Why aren't we all constantly adapting properly? Well, what D.D. Palmer was finding is if all the bones in the spine weren't properly aligned, they would affect the nervous system so that you don't become less intelligent, but your nervous system doesn't respond to that intelligence properly. So if we could get the bones in the spine aligned properly so that they weren't affecting the nervous system could then respond to your innate intelligence and make you healthy. And I've had a lot of fun helping a lot of people with a lot of different things that it turned out the problem was their nervous system wasn't responding to their intelligence properly. At least that's the philosophy I'm using when I'm working with patients.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe your practice and the approach that you take towards people, maybe how you identify subluxations, how you address them, how you communicate with people? Does your practice have other employees? What's the structure from the inside out?
Sure. Right now I'm retired. I retired end of April. So I'm freshly retired. And what I want to do is help teach. That's why I've got time now to do more of the podcasts and teaching. I started out as an intern with E.L. Crowder in Davenport, Iowa. So Dr. Crowder was head of instrumentation under B.J. Palmer, who was the developer of chiropractic, actually the son of our founder, D.D. Palmer. And what they were working on is how can we determine, it was really trying to take a scientific approach to what we call the subluxation, this misalignment of the bones that is causing interference to the nervous system. How can we scientifically decide what's going on? And what they were doing was using X-ray. And what we found was if you change the position of somebody's body, their X-ray will make it look like they've got a misalignment that maybe they don't really have. So what he wanted to do is create an apparatus. And actually, I've got pictures of it. I don't know if you've seen this. This is the about BJ Palmer Clinic. Here, I got does that come across? So this is a brochure from the BJ Palmer Clinic, and they were actually doing research. I don't know how many are aware, but the modern day EEG, the electroencephalograph, was really the prototype for that was actually developed at Palmer College. And what they were doing was putting electrodes on the skull and then down the brain and trying to determine if the electrical activity changed at different spots along the spine, trying to, again, to determine what's going on. So I've got pictures in here. I don't know if we really got time for me to find them, but there's pictures in here. They'd actually put clamps on people's heads and position their body so that they could reposition them in the same position after an adjustment to determine if the misalignment had been corrected. Then they were using this, what Palmer called the electroencephaloneuromantimpograph. And what they were doing is making recordings of this electrical activity. Well, now we do this, and we've got computers that can take away all the noise, but they had to put people in a grounded and shielded booth. So it used a Faraday shield all the way around and put them in this cage. So there was no electromagnetic radiation coming into the patient that could affect the equipment. It was pretty cool. Crowder told me that working in that booth, he said, there's something that we miss when we're in there. He said, working in the booth with the the tempograph, they called it, working with that for an hour was like 8 hours of hard labor. He said, I don't know what it is, but there's something about our environment that we get an energy from or something, because he said it was really exhausting. So interesting findings. Anyway, he was using a scope, and they started using temperature differentials to locate subluxation back in the 20s. And back then it was a thermocouple. And what happens with the thermocouple is two different metals that, when they're warmed, create an electrical current. So they put one on each side of the spine, and then the difference in the electrical activity or the warmth would cause a needle to move one way or the other. And the original idea was that subluxation would create a short in the nerve, which would produce heat, just like an electrical short in your house. So they're monitoring that heat. But eventually what they found was they shifted to an upper cervical where they were just adjusting the bones at the top of the spine. And they found that if they got those right, all of the temperatures would change. So they went from an area where, well, I'm going to run this scope up, and where I see this differential, that's where I'm going to adjust. They changed to saying, okay, well, if all of them can be affected, then how do I know where to adjust? And what they decided was, if we adjust it up here and just monitor everything, we're going to see change all the way down. So that became, if you think about it, that's consistent with our philosophy. If our philosophy is about adaptation, then when somebody's subluxated, they're going to be failing to adapt. And that's what I started using. So I now use a Titron scanner, and it uses infrared radiation. So it's actually got an infrared sensor on both sides of the spine, and it converts that into electrical activity. Its software uses it and actually gives me this pattern of the electrical activity across the skin of the spine. And then what I'm looking for is it in pattern? Because if it's in pattern, then the body's not adapting and responding to its environment. It's doing the same thing all the time. I once took a course by Holder, the torque release technique. And one of the questions he asked is, what is it that all diseases have in common? And I'm sitting there going, what is it that all diseases have in common? He said, we're constantly responding inappropriately to our environment. And he said, if that wasn't true, if we weren't locked in to this constant inappropriate response to our environment, you couldn't diagnose anybody because they'd be constantly changing. And that just made sense to me. And that's what we're doing with thermography, is I'm actually testing somebody and saying, okay, are they adapting to their environment or not? If they're not adapting, okay, what can I do? How do I decide what's going on with their body, and how can I, what we call adjusting them, correcting that subluxation? How do I adjust them so that they can properly adapt to their environment? And then what I do is I just rerun the scan again to see if they changed. And if they start changing and start balancing, I can tell somebody before they get off the table whether I can help them or not. And that's really cool. I have fun with that. So that's how I practice. So I started out when I was an intern with Dr. Crowder. He was only adjusting upper cervical. So I started just doing that. And my very first patient was a person with low back pain. She could hardly put her foot on the floor. So she's kind of hopping in. And I x-rayed her low back and I x-rayed her neck. And based on my exam, I thought her problem was going to be in her neck, but I x-rayed her low back as well. I adjusted her neck and she was able to walk out the door. But it was interesting, you know, we sometimes talk about having faith in what you do. And I can remember my thought on that very first patient, because I was going to adjust her neck, but her low back was her pain spot, right? And I remember thinking, well, here we go. This either works or it doesn't. And I adjusted her and it worked. So that kind of kept me on the right path. But I got off the path with a person who was having heart problems. And I was checking her this day, and it seemed like she had a problem in her mid-back. And I hadn't x-rayed that spot. So I x-rayed her mid-back, and sure enough, she had a scoliosis in her thoracics. And I adjusted that scoliosis, and I remember this is on a Friday, and she just had a 24-hour EKG with her doctor. And she came in on Monday. I said, you know, this is where the nerves go to your heart. Maybe this will have any effect. I don't know. But you know, it might have an effect. She came in Monday and she said, is my doctor mad at me? I said, why is that? Well, I went in for my report on that 24-hour EKG and he told me I needed a whole fistful of pills. I said, no, I don't. I'm fine. So what apparently it turned out, I think she was having atrial fibrillation, which we knew a lot less about back then. But, you know, once she got adjusted, it snapped her out of that and then she felt fine. Well, I said, well, I didn't tell you to tell him that. No, but I do. I feel fine. I can walk up the steps now and nothing bothers me. So that kind of changed. Once I realized, you know, I'd missed that, I began x-raying people full spine every time I saw them because I didn't want to miss anything anymore. Mm. And then I found out about, you know, a different way to x-ray the neck. And I had somebody else who was really dizzy. And I x-rayed her neck differently and adjusted her. And all I did was change how I adjusted her from like this to like this. And I could stop her dizziness. And it's just fun to figure out people and help them like that. Mm-hmm. So I switched from that. And then I went to torque release technique. And torque release technique, what I liked about that was you have somebody face down and you decide where to adjust them based on putting a pressure on the spine and watching the feet to see if they can adapt to that pressure or not. And if that pressure makes them a leg go short or change a length in the legs, then that indicates they're not adapting properly. So I started using that to decide, okay, where am I going to adjust them? So I was using the x-ray to decide what the misalignments were. And then I'd use the torque release technique to decide which one I'm going to adjust. And then I use pre and post thermography to decide whether it actually affected the nervous system or not. And it really became a pretty cool system. And what I discovered was a lot of times when I thought I was adjusting somebody, it wasn't doing anything. And a lot of times I could do something up in the neck and I could see a response in the low back immediately. I mean, really quick. So it was fun. I had somebody came in one day who was both a medical doctor and a chiropractor. And one of my patients had sent him to me. And he said, I don't buy into that innate intelligence. I said, well, I'm not going to take you as a patient unless you let me x-ray you. And he said, no, I don't want x-rays. I don't believe any of that. And I told him I could use a light low force technique. And I said, I don't know if it'll help or not, but if you want, I'll try that. And it was on a Saturday morning. I had time. So he wanted to do that. So he did let me do my thermography. And I worked on him for like 30 minutes. I had no change in the thermography. I said, look, get up. I can't help you. And he said, what do you mean you can't help me? I said, do you feel any different? And he said, no. I said, well, that's what I mean. I can't help you. And I showed him the change, that there'd been no change in the thermography. And he just looked at me. He said, all right, I'm going to tell my friend to keep coming to you. At least you know that you're doing something. But, you know, I didn't change his belief systems, but he recognized that I know that whether or not I'm changing a person. And I think that's what we've got to be able to do. So that's what I'm trying to teach is a system. How do we determine and how do we help people adapt better so that they can be healthier? One of the things, by the way, we were talking, I guess before the show even started, we were talking about how do I talk to patients, or how do I explain what I'm doing? And one of the things I like to talk about is health. And if we look at the definition of health, the one I've enjoyed the most is Dorland's Medical Dictionary definition, which was health is optimal physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And the real key to that, a lot of people see that and they focus on, it's not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. That's not where I like to go. I like to go back to optimal. What is optimal? It's not too much and it's not too little. It's exactly right for that moment in time. That implies a decision. That implies some kind of an intelligence is monitoring everything and saying, okay, well, this isn't optimal right now. We got to change it. And what are we doing medically? If we don't think about intelligence, what are we doing medically? We compare this person's physiology to some average group that seems to perform better than people that are doing what this person's physiology is doing right now. We try to make them like the average. But what we don't know is what's appropriate for that person right now, because we're not looking at it that the patient is having an intelligence. We're just trying to control them from the outside. So that's really one of the differences in chiropractic, is recognizing the intelligence of the patient and trying to cooperate with that, rather than forcing what we think should be right onto the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just want to thank you for creating the book that you made probably 15 years ago, but I just remember being in school and finding that book in the library, and
Oh, really?
that being really helpful for me at that stage of where I was at in school, of just believe there are many different things that you kind of packaged in a fairly short book, but it was like a concise, these are some of the things that I look at. This is what chiropractic is. This is how chiropractic is applied in clinical practice. And these are some of the ways that I've been able to reflect and describe my experience as a chiropractor. I think you did a really nice job with that book. Yes.
Yeah, it's been interesting. That book didn't get a lot of popularity, but a friend of mine from college, from my undergrad days, left a message on my phone, and I hadn't seen him since college. And I called him back, and I thought I recognized the voice. Anyway, I called him back, and he said he was one of the most intelligent men I ever met. And I always have wondered what happened to him. Well, he wound up, he applied to law school because he's thinking about law and he was thinking about medicine. So he applied to both. And he's kind of letting the universe decide, kind of thing, Well, I think he was waitlisted at Harvard for medicine or something, but everybody accepted him because he's a genius. So everybody did accept him in either law or medicine. So that didn't help. So I always wondered what he did. Well, he wound up going to the University of Kansas Law School. He clerked at the Supreme Court. And then he decided to go into medicine. So he went to Mayo's Medical School and completed that. And then he decided he was never going to practice, but he completed it anyway. So he's been fascinating. And he found me because he saw a couple of my books in the KU Medical School library, or in some medical school library. So that's what made him decide to try to find me. So it's interesting now when you do something like that. As BJ said, you never know how far-reaching something we may say or do today will affect millions tomorrow. So I appreciate that. That's nice to hear that helped you out.
Definitely. What inspired you to get it into the Kansas Medical Library? And I'm just curious.
I didn't put it there. And I'm not sure. I thought he said it was in the Kansas. He's a bit of a researcher anyway, so he may have been using he didn't go to KU's medical school, but he may have been using their library for some reason. But yeah, I didn't put it there somehow. And that's what surprised me. I was surprised that he could find it there.
What are your favorite resources or your favorite books that you would recommend somebody before they go to chiropractic school start to really explore and immerse themselves with?
That's a challenge. I don't know that it's too different than life. I think we've all got to decide how we believe life works. And unless you can come up with a duality, I mean, that really is one of the things that has been most helpful for me, is to realize that there is a duality and I'm not always in control of my brain. And once I started realizing that I'm not in control of my brain, it changes everything, because then I can look at what I'm thinking and decide, is that what I want to think about, or do I want to think about something else? And if you realize that you can make that control, then you're one step into chiropractic already, because you're already going into an intelligence-based system rather than a chemistry-based system. That makes sense? So if that makes sense to you, and you want to help people use their own intelligence, I don't want to make a decision for somebody else. I want them to come to a decision for themselves. We're not all the same. When I first got into chiropractic, I did it because I thought being a chiropractor was more important than helping people get the right computer. And I don't believe that anymore. I think chiropractic is important for people who want to help people by adjusting their spine and helping the nervous system and helping them be all they can be. But there are other fields that are equally important. And the main thing is to find out what you really want to do. What do you resonate with? What is it that makes sense to you? And as my father said, no matter what it is you get into, there are going to be days when you don't want to go do it. He said, what you want to do is find something where you have the least number of those days. I've never had a day when I didn't want to get up and do something. I enjoyed seeing my patients. And by the way, the other thing is, I realized that I like talking to people. I like teaching. I like that actually more than adjusting people. So if I don't have time to talk to people, I don't have a good day. So I went from, I kind of dropped out. I had a lot of spiritual stuff going on, and I kind of dropped out in my, about 20 years ago, before I wrote the books. And when I was kind of coming out of that phase when I started writing the books. And one of the things I realized was I enjoyed teaching. If I can, let me give you this experience. I had an associate for a while. I built up my practice. I hired an associate, and we were really close for about 8 years. And he said, Doc, I'm having trouble with this patient. Would you look at these x-rays before you go home? So I said, okay. And he said, I left him on the view box. So I went into the x-ray room, looked at the view box, and I wrote on him what I do. And I got home and the phone rang. And I answered the phone. He said, Doc, that worked great. And I realized at that point, I felt just as good as if I'd done it myself. I didn't have to be the one that did the adjustment. If I could teach somebody else how to do it, and they told me how much better their life was because of that, that was good. That was a win. I felt good about it. And I started teaching at Palmer College, and I taught in the chiropractic technician program. I taught clinical chemistry, so how to draw blood and how to analyze blood and urine samples and that stuff. And I really enjoyed teaching. And then my father-in-law was Dean of Rehab Medicine at the University of Alberta, and he was on sabbatical at Western Washington University here in Bellingham, Washington. I'm in Blaine now, but Bellingham's just 20 minutes away. Anyway, he was on faculty there and noticed that they were looking for somebody to teach in the College of Business and Economics. So I applied for that because I didn't have my license yet. I couldn't get started. I applied for that, and they interviewed me over the phone and hired me to teach Introduction to Business. So I got to teach that, and then they had me teach organization behavior for a couple more courses, 3 more quarters, I think. So I taught until I got my practice going, and then I stopped teaching and just did the practice. But what I realized about myself is I enjoy teaching. So what I'm trying to do now is focus on teaching and less on actually practicing. So I'm hoping that comes across in this, that I enjoy talking to you. I enjoy trying to help you how to, not what to think, but how to think, what to think about, how to think.
So these conversations that I'm having, just to continue to build context, are really for the student to, like, I'm trying to act as the student.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm thinking about just kind of, I'm transforming myself into the student. Basically, the way that I'm asking students to orient themselves is to be scientists, thinkers, artists, teachers, and entrepreneurs. and I think you just reflected on your passion as being a teacher.
Right.
I'm curious about the entrepreneurial part. I did read that you had a passion for real estate, or just better understanding kind of how to leverage like this energetic exchange of, you providing a highly valuable service as a chiropractor, you receiving monetary exchange, and then how you direct that energy. So how have you directed the energy that's been given to you for all of the value that you've provided for people?
Well, let me take that just a little bit differently. How I got into real estate. My second oldest son um, was working for a son of a friend of mine, and she and I had become quite close. I mentioned, I don't know how much time we've got in to go into this, but my spiritual journey really involved this other person, and her son was getting into construction. My son was in high school and he's trying to decide what to do. He decided to get into the construction program. So he actually completed a construction, like a AA degree, while he was in high school, and he's working for her
So
son.
not to cut you off,
Yeah,
but I just want you to give me answers that are for the student to really take your information that you're sharing, and like just it's just dropping
yeah, give
seeds.
me
It's
one,
planting seeds.
give me 1 minute. So what happened was, through this construction thing, she got me to take the real estate program to actually get a real estate license. And what happened there was I realized how ignorant I was about real estate. We wound up changing our house and selling it. And I made 100 grand on that first house. Okay. So it's a long way of saying I realized that I didn't know about real estate. And once I knew about real estate, I applied what I learned from the MBA program to systematize how to learn about real estate. So now I help my son, who flips houses or creates new houses, and he's making more than, well, this year he'll probably make close to 3 times what the average chiropractor makes as a general contractor at 38. Okay. So there's a lot of ways you can do things and make money. He's not somebody that's would do well as a chiropractor. Okay. And this gets back to what you're saying. How do I decide what I want to do with my life? Well, what is it that's going to bring you joy, and what are your talents? My son can look at a set of plans and go, oh, this is going to look great. I can't see things like that. He built a new house for me, and he says, well, when you go from the kitchen to the living room, you're going to go from a 10-foot high ceiling up to 16 feet. We built this big house, right? That's one of the things we were able to do. You're asking, what can we do with the energy? Well, that's an example. But he could do that for me because I couldn't see that on the plans. He'd look at the plans and go, this is what that's going to look like. I don't have that ability. So a student has to be able to really look inside themselves and experience enough things to say, this is what I'm good at. This is my contribution to the world. And for my son, it's being able to look at properties and go, okay, well, we could build this, right? So I'm hoping that's more helpful. Isn't that kind of what you wanted?
Yeah, no, I just read it on your website that there was an aspect to the courses that you're teaching which has to do with real estate. So I just was curious.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So what I'm doing with my courses is the mental mastery. Then I go through business. There's a lot of stuff that I learned. The MBA program was a 2-year program. Again, I completed in a year by going through the summers. But there's an awful lot of stuff you learn in school that doesn't apply. And then you get into business, and if you're an entrepreneur, the MBA program got me a job at IBM, and more of it applied there. But when I became an entrepreneur, there was a lot of stuff I needed to know as an entrepreneur that I didn't get in the MBA program. I got it on the job. And I think we need more and more on the job training. So what I came up with is a series of little videos that you can complete in about an hour that gives you the business training you need to be an entrepreneur. And then when I talk to people, I talk to attorneys, I've talked to dentists, and they all agree we all need the same training, because we don't learn how to be an entrepreneur when we get our professional education. So I started this business stuff, and then so that's just one aspect of it. And then one of the other courses in the MBA program was the capital budgeting decision. Well, that's all about how do you evaluate different business alternatives. Well, I applied that then to how do we evaluate a business, a chiropractic business? And what I found on Facebook and a lot of other things, older chiropractors were telling younger ones how to evaluate a business, and it didn't make any sense. They were telling people to do things. You could be paying a lot of money for a business that was losing money. That doesn't make any sense. So I started a course on I call it practice valuation. How much is a business worth? That became another course. And then along the way, I'd taken a bunch of stuff on negotiation tactics. So I came up with 12 negotiation tactics, and I actually went through an actual purchase and sale agreement that I put together for one of my son's houses. And I went through the process of negotiating that. And then my wife went in and negotiated a new car. And I went through the process of that, and what that was really like. So that's the negotiation part. One of the things I haven't added yet is marketing. I've got to go through a little marketing program, but my goal is to take somebody that knows nothing about business all the way over here to somebody that can be competent and know how to think about it. And you still need the accountants, the attorneys, and all these other people. But how do you speak to them? One of the things I got from one of the professors in the MBA program, he said, we're not training you to be a marketing specialist or an accounting specialist or a legal specialist. We're training you to have the vocabulary and know how to talk to each of those and ask them a question and know what they're talking about when you talk to them. Well, we don't get that in chiropractic. You don't get that in medicine. You don't get that in dental school. I'm trying to provide something that nobody else can get anywhere else. So that's really what the Affolter Academy is about.
Awesome. Well, hey man.
And then you mentioned real estate. When I actually saw how ignorant I was about real estate, I wrote a book on real estate. And that's if somebody just Googles or goes to Amazon and puts my name in, they'll see all my books. They're all available at Amazon. Back when Obama was first getting in and talking about healthcare, I wrote 2 books. One was How Politics Increased the Cost of Healthcare in America, and the other one was the Science of Medicine and the Dollars it Generates. And what I'm really looking at is we're not using an intelligence-based system. And I put both those together and called it a book. I titled it Dupe 'em and Dope 'em, because I think a lot of the research that we're doing isn't designed to make people healthy. It's just designed to make them feel better. We're duping them and doping them by giving them the drugs, and they really don't actually get better. Feel better, but they don't become more healthy. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, as I learn something, I try to teach somebody else, because at heart I'm a teacher. And I feel like when I learned about real estate, I said I don't want people to be as ignorant as I was, so I wrote a book about real estate. So again, it gets back to being who you are, figuring out who you are, and then taking that out to the world.